Welcome to the Hollow Path podcast, where tonight's guest is author, magician, priest, scholar, poet, and general all-round amazing person, Georgia van Raalte. Georgia, good evening.
Hi, thank you for that introduction.
You're very welcome. Well, you really are one of the people who I know as a sort of a colleague and friend who really covers so many of these different bases, and yet I feel you manage to combine them into a coherent body of work and a coherent practice, is what it looks like. Maybe it doesn't always feel like that.
I definitely try to make it as coherent as possible.
Now, I'm going to kick off things with what is becoming my standard question, and that is this. What is your relationship to magic?
That's a very large question. And to me, it's sort of difficult to answer without either attempting to define magic or at least make some headway as to what that would mean. But my real first impulse when you asked that was to say, well, it's everything. It's just all the good stuff, all the juicy stuff, all of the stuff that is in between and both and. It's the stuff that, you know, it's not quite connect. I'm going to get I want to get very poetic right off the bat, right? Because to me, if you say, what is magic to you? It's like, it's the tentacles, it's the worms, it's everything that's going between. It's my ability to connect the strange poetical images with the academic work I'm doing. That for me is like the big magic that I'm able to do. So the sort of starting with the coherence was sort of funny to me, because that is for me, my connection with magic is that I have been able, my unique path has led me to this place that I can do a form of academic work, of writing that is deeply magical, but is also more than that, and can enter into knowledge economy, right? The academic knowledge economy in a way that so many magical texts can't, or other magical texts can't. That's a bit round.
Well, that is a brilliant answer, because I love the way it seemed like your answer literally followed the steps of a sort of a progression. Like you started off answering like a sort of an old school academic saying, well, first we're going to have to define magic, aren't we? And then you were like, but, and then you went on to talk about it like I would say a trendy academic, saying, yes, it's all about the connection and the liminality and the yes and, or the both or, and the and then you went on to speak about it like a poet. And I think absolutely this is it. This is what you seem to be able to do, which is not to split yourself into different parts, like not to say, okay, that's my academic self, and that's my magical self, and that's my poetic self, and that's me as a I don't know, as a wife, that's me as a mother, that's me as a woman, that's me as a, I don't know, sports ball player or whatever else. But when I see your work and when I hear you talk about it, you do seem to manage to make it just a way of being, like it's all part of the same thing.
See, it's funny, like I have been posed this question since early on in my academic career, like, how am I going to juggle these two things? Because as soon as I got into, you know, the academic side of things, I also got into practice. And so that was like a primary concern. And yet it also was never a concern. Like, it's funny hearing you go that you're able to do this. I'm like, it's just that I'm not able to do anything else. Like, there is no way that I could not combine all of these things. So it was always just a matter of the best way to do them all together, the best way to just be me across all of these spheres, because I was not ever able to work out a way. It just doesn't make sense to me to try and box them off. It's bizarre. Just, it's got me into trouble, but it's paid off.
I relate to that, because also when I found myself in positions where I had to compartmentalize, I felt I suffered, and that it was only when I had the sort of the confidence to, for example, in my teaching or in my academic work, to bring some of that magical sensibility or poetic sensibility, and also then in vice versa, to bring the sort of the kind of scholarly and academic rigor into my engagement with questions of magic, in fact. Then I felt I was thriving. But I guess in the past, I did have to keep them somewhat separate at times. It made me suffer. And when I tried to mix them up around the wrong kind of people, it also got me in trouble. How did you said that you started to discover them at the same time? Academia, being a scholar, and magic. You discovered them around the same time, and were they in essence the same discovery? Like what put you on that path?
I hadn't considered them being the same discovery before, but I guess they were aspects of the same thing. So I already loved scholarship during my undergrad. And I was going to say just before that so I did a theological studies, Christian theology for my undergrad. And that has sort of always impacted my confidence, because I like confidence in being a practitioner, right? Because I was brought up, scholarly speaking, among people who were professing their faith and practice as part of an academic study, right? And there was just no distinction. Well, there is a distinction, but it's very different. And so I always just came from that place. But so I came straight from that to the Amsterdam HHP, the Center of Hermetic Philosophy, and doing my MA there was my first, discovery of these esoteric topics.
Can I just interject there for a sec and say, I know what it is, but I think when some people hear the words, well, I went to Amsterdam to the Center for Hermetic Studies, they'll go, the what now? That's a real thing? So tell us about going to Hogwarts in Amsterdam. I mean, what? Tell us about going to Magical University in Amsterdam. How is that even a thing?
And, I will tell you the story of how I got there, because it is also pretty magical. I was at St. Andrews in our little theological college, wondering what I was going to do next. And I saw in a hallway that I didn't normally go in, a poster. And it had that picture of the alchemist where he's sticking his head out of the sky and he's got his body on the earth and his head out. And I was like, oh, that looks cool. Oh, that looks really cool. And it was a poster for the University of Amsterdam's Religious Studies Department, MA in esoteric. Is it called esoteric currents? I think is the technical term that's like on my certificate. And that is run by the HHP, which is the Center for the History of Hermetic Philosophy, and is a big research center. They have, many academics there writing and researching and whatnot on a whole range of esoteric topics. I think at the moment their specialties are 20th century magic, alchemy, early Gnosticism, and like the general history of esotericism. And it's a wonderful place. It also is, one of the contexts in which being a practitioner is contentious, because it's a very, very serious academic establishment. Now I think that is beginning to change a little more, but certainly when I was doing my MA there was a strong sense that although everyone who's doing it was also experimenting with esoteric technologies and thought, we were all not supposed to bring that into our work. But of course
funnily enough, I was just thinking, gosh, yes, how strange, I mean, for a start, just the fact that the place exists is wonderful to me, and that it's, it's certainly the most well-known one, but there are a few other departments that also have these things, and then I thought, gosh, isn't it funny to imagine all of these people studying the occult and the esoteric during the day and then going home at night and furtively doing experiments. But it occurred to me, actually, if you go and do a master's in English literature, right? You're not supposed to talk about the fact that you're a writer, you're not supposed to admit that you write poetry. you go and kind of do secret experiments in writing, kind of almost ashamedly, unless of course you're doing an MFA in America, but that's a whole other weird thing, possibly more esoteric and occult than actually studying occultism. But yeah, but it's actually like, when you're studying literature, you don't admit that you're a practitioner. You don't talk about it. It's considered bad form.
Yeah, it's funny. I think that, and like well, I was going to say, there are certain areas within religious studies where, or like within anthropological studies, where you might not admit to being part of a group that you're studying. But really, these days, if you're doing religious studies or theology, it's more likely that you're a member of the group, the religious practitioner group that you're talking about, than that you're not. And that's one of the things that I think is a little bit different about esotericism and occultism, is although we're calling poetry a practice, and it's not, and yes, it is also a religious practice, but it's not in the same way like a genuinely persecuted religion that occultism and esoteric practices still are. And I think the fact that, for instance, like there are still, programs, courses, research centers that specify that they are not made up of practitioners. Well, you couldn't have a Christian research center that was like, but we don't have any Christians here. You wouldn't ever do that. You wouldn't have a center for the study of Islamic theology and then say that you wouldn't allow practicing Muslims. I mean, like, you couldn't even conceive of doing this with any other religion, but it goes with the sort of demonization of magical religion that's cool.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely. Now, let's ask this question then. And again, this is one of those ones that is going to sound impossibly vast and seem to demand definitions, but let's just go with whatever comes into your head. Why are magic and religion not the same thing?
Well, if I was being very epithetical and not very accurate, I'd say magic is what you call other people's religion.
Ooh, nice. Epigrammatic, if you were being epigrammatic.
That's epigrammatic. Magic as a category is, as a polemical, right? The history of that term, magia, it was originally used in a polemical way. Magic has always been about other people's spiritual traditions, other people's spiritual techniques. I think the way that magic is used and experienced now, there is a difference between religion and magic, but I don't believe that is one that is like some deep inherent distinction. It's just a sort of historical distinction, if you will. Yeah,
interesting. And could you, I mean, what occurs to me, my first thing would be that magic is proactive, and that religion tends to be not passive, more like receptive, as in, you can pray, but you're praying for the what's the word? The intervention of some other agency, not yourself. Whereas in magic, it seems like you are more in control. Like it's more about
only
proactive, a proactive practice than praying for divine intercession,
But I mean, praying for divine intercession is one very, very small aspect of religion. Make that the kind of thing that you're trying to draw. Well, that depends on what you're calling religion. Religious practices are huge and hugely varied. That, is magic more direct than certain forms of Christianity that focus on intercessory prayer? But yeah, I think so. But I wouldn't ever say that you could draw from that. Again, now people view magic as being this very direct thing as opposed to this more obscure religious structure. But that is only one version of religion. I think one of the weakest elements, and I mean in its power, one of the weakest elements of contemporary magic is that it's so scared of religion. The gods are the most powerful part of magic, but most magical practitioners are scared of them or consider the direct route, or that there's a way of avoiding them that's more powerful. That's just not, not true.
Yeah, I think that it's always a bit weird to me when people try to sort of promote the idea of magic, but with this very kind of atheist thing, like, or anti-religious thing. It's like, I mean, I agree with you fundamentally. Yes, I agree that they're basically maybe just different ways of looking at the same thing, or some of the same things, or maybe there's something about like one being an exoteric practice and one being an esoteric practice, but again, not always. However, yeah, sorry, go on.
No, you're making me think that perhaps it would be more accurate to say that magic is a quality of something. There could be a magical religion, and there can be magical practice, and there can be magical religious practice, and there can be different levels of that something is or is not magical. But I think to sort of put magic and religion against each other is just a false opposition, because one is a form of structure and one is a mode of relationality or quality.
Okay, good. I like that. I like that. Now, again, that's one of those things as well that I want to be a bit wary, because I think we could literally just spend the next hour just on that one question. And quite possibly, I think both of us would end up after it writing each other long messages saying, no, actually, that's not exactly what I wanted to say. Like, I've got, notice, I thought of another bit, right? So, but let's write books on it. Let's write books on that instead. Speaking of which, you've written a number of books, and I guess, am I right in saying that your PhD thesis was basically your first book-length project that you did?
I think that I published my first magical book before I finished my thesis. But the thesis was significantly longer than that. So I published 3 little, very small occult, theological, mystical books. And I consider them quite a separate kind of work than the PhD thesis, which was like 100,000 words.
Bloody hell. Yeah, so that's interesting too, because perhaps it's worth noting that in your practice, in your sort of magical writing and your magical work, there is a good part of it, including those books, which is also devotional, and which is also sort of priesthood work, and which is also mystical. So actually, yeah, you're a terrible person to ask the difference between religion and magic, because, like, you're doing them all at the same time. Tell us first then, what about those 3 books? You're writing them partly, as I said, and I've read one of them and a bit of another. You're writing them partly as devotional work, partly as sort of almost part of your ministry. And we're talking about the Templum Abyssi, the Temple of the Abyss, to some degree, in which you are a priestess, correct?
Yes. Although we are still sort of on a bit of a hiatus at the moment from active ministry, because it's hard doing active ministry with a toddler. There's no escaping that difficulty sometimes. But no, they're absolutely devotional works, but they weren't ever conceived like, they were not planned books in the way that they're written. So all 3 of them, I wrote a bunch of stuff over the course of like my first 4 years getting involved in magical practice. I wrote a lot of essays, devotional essays, usually about Babalon, the goddess. And they were often sort of, if not, I have a complicated relationship with the word channel, but they were spontaneous. They were not, planned out or researched. Yeah. A bunch of poetry and visionary material of various kinds, and some rituals, which were a lot more planned out. And I did often a series of different times and in different iterations. And then once I sort of realized I had all this big bunch of material a couple, like 2 years ago, I decided to sort of group them into these books. And the first one was The Priestess and the Pearls, was done with Black Moon, and they specifically wanted the rituals that I'd been doing. So that's all the rituals. And then Approaching Babylon is all of the essays. So that one is the most sort of like full book, but it was not written in one continuous go like a book. They were written across the period. And the final one is the poetry and the visionary stuff, which was by far the most like sort of anxiety inducing to publish. And I haven't done much promotional work on because of that, but I'm glad I put it out there.
Because yeah, that's highly personal, that stuff. And I think I'd be very much with you on having a certain wariness about the word channeling, but like the idea of inspired speech and inspired poetry and devotional poetry and visionary poetry, like all of those things seem to fit. But tell us then a little bit, for those who don't know, about Babalon, the goddess.
What about Babalon? It's funny, I haven't, although she's my primary deity I work with, I'd also been on somewhat of a hiatus or from that particular veil of her recently, but I'm actually hosting 2 full moon events this weekend, both dedicated to her. So she is making herself known once again. Babalon is a goddess. The way that we use her, most contemporary practitioners work with her, stems in a large part from Aleister Crowley's work and his magical religion, Thelema. But she is the same Babalon as is mentioned in the Book of Revelations and appeared to John Dee. Yeah. She's usually worked with in a pretty direct devotional way. That's one of the things about this question of devotion. As a goddess like Babalon, the specifics of that practice sort of revolve around the magical qualities of devotion and play with that religion, anti-religion sort of dichotomy pretty well, I think. I don't know, it's hard to introduce something that's like such a huge thing in just a few minutes.
I mean, I think that you know, people have, at least in sort of occult and pagan spheres, have, I would say, I mean, I'm just guessing here because I'm no expert on it, but in the last maybe 10 years or so, 10, 15 years, she has definitely become very visible as an archetype. And I know that some people would know her from the sort of Aleister Crowley, but like they would know her from Aleister Crowley even if they haven't read any Aleister Crowley. Like they'd know sort of her anecdotally as the kind of the archetype of the Scarlet Woman that he was in search of. They'd maybe know her from the kind of the mythology around Jack Parsons as well. They would know her, you know, another place that I think she is present, as you say, in John Dee, and that like that sort of the daughter of fortitude stuff, and like that's incredibly resonant, and the Book of Revelations. And then if they've made the connection between those things, they begin to have an idea, but she seems to also escape easy definition. Like you say, she seems to be an expert figure in troubling categories and blurring categories and messing things up. But there's also a kind of a corny idea of her, like as this kind of vampy sex Scarlet Woman, sex goddess, basically. Which, I mean, obviously she is, but so much more than that. Does that ever bother you when you think people look at her as a bit of like an occult bimbo type sort of I mean, cartoony kind of figure?
It used to, and a lot of the stuff, the material in approaching Babalon came from this place of like this, you know, Babalon is not supposed to be a sex symbol. That's not what this is about. These days, I mostly think that actually very few people really believe that. And most people, and even then, there's an archetypal level that it is true. So it bothers me a lot less than it used to, because, you know, people are stupid. They will be stupid if they want to. But the level at which, I mean, I'm thinking about like Margot Robbie in Hollywood Babylon, or it's just called Babylon, right? Like there is this general femme fatale, and it's linked with like Lilith and these other, you know, dark femme fatales. That is true. So the bimbofication of it is sort of, you know, it is obviously not ideal, but it doesn't sort of bother me the way that it used to.
Yeah. No, you're right, actually. You're right that it's not, bimbo is the wrong word, although sometimes it veers towards that, but femme fatale. And actually, I mean, yeah, I can't really argue. Like, that is that archetype, right? So you have had this kind of intense personal relationship with her, but you've also kind of expanded into this kind of ministry, this kind of visionary work where you I don't know, preach her gospel, I guess, in a way, through your books, a ministry through
quite like that.
well, a ministry in which you lead ritual and teach ritual. I don't know, what would you call it?
Well, the ministry, I don't mind. The preaching her gospel, I'm not sure is so accurate, because it would require the idea of a fixed gospel, which I think the nature of Babylon, denies there being a single holy text. And I try very hard not to preach about it. So.
Yes. Oh, okay. Well, I guess, let me put it this way then. Like that's, I mean, I don't know, the gospel's not a good word because of that connotation, but like even the gospels, none of them are the same. But like, so, I hear what you're saying about not preaching, but let's say you're one of her voices crying out in the wilderness. How about that?
So I mean, absolutely. It's funny because it's not like I can explain why, because it's not like a choice. It's just sort of what happened and what I have to do. And for me, it's caught up with Babylon not only as this like goddess, which she only is in a very complex way as well, right? It's not a simple deity or as simple a deity as a historical reconstruction of previous pagan worship. This is something far more complex. And so a lot of what the ministry, as you call it, is about, I mean, to me, my goal is initiation. It doesn't have to be about Babylon. It's just that she is a particularly potent force of initiation in the current moment. And that has been sort of, what I have been entrusted with, yes, if you will, is to sort of promote ideas of initiation and specifically as something that does not need to be specifically only magical or specifically only artistic or specifically only being studied, but as something that is like truly a category that transcends all these things.
Okay, well, let's talk about that. I mean, it sounds very much like this is a sort of inescapable vocation for you. You are called to do this. And you are called then to act as a vector of initiation. And especially in this moment, let's talk about that. Like, what is initiation? Like, I'm sorry to ask you, I don't want a definition again. I want you, like, what is your take? What does initiation mean to you?
No, I'm just smiling at the vector of initiation. I like that a lot, actually. I'll use that. And I like it as well because I've moved further and further from the idea of being an initiator or being an initiatrix and more towards just wanting to, I don't know, something that's more roundabout and, prompting, encouraging to me. And some of this is because of what I understand initiation to be. I firmly believe or have come to understand that initiation is about contact, right? When you are initiated, what you initiate is a relationship with some kind of, person of whatever form or non-person. And that's sort of the crux of initiation. So as a human person, I cannot initiate. I can only be a vector of initiation. I can only attempt to create the right circumstances and lead somebody to a place where they can make that connection for themselves. And that's sort of how I see it.
Okay, and is it as an experience in our world, let's say, someone like you could be a source or a help or a guide, but what if you were someone like you, but like 15 years ago, and you didn't have guides or sources for initiation? Or did you? I don't know. How did it happen to you?
I was like 15 years ago. So I wasn't doing much in the way of magical practice. I mean, and this has been an ongoing thing for me though, is when I say that I began when I did my MA, I mean that, right? Like, I didn't have a magical practice beforehand. I didn't know any of this. I was a philosopher, I was a thinker, I was obsessed with different religious systems, but I did not begin what I like. Even I got interested, you know, I began my MA, doing the academic side. I'm getting really interested in the practice. I'm going to my first Gnostic mass. I'm engaging in all these different modalities. And then it built from there. So by the time I was seeking sort of anything like a formal initiation, I was already heavily in, you know, both these worlds.
Yeah.
And I never really had, an early initiation figure in that sense, I think. Or maybe it was Dion Fortune herself, I suppose, if I think about it. Since she was sort of guide.
Let's talk about that then, because your PhD work that you went, so after your MA, you went to Sussex, right, for the PhD?
Surrey.
Oh, that's where my parents went. That's where they met. But you university, and you there did a PhD. Now, PhD on the work of Dion Fortune, but on Dion Fortune's fictional work. Is that right?
Yes, it was on her novels.
So this is really interesting, because now we can kind of bring it back around. The point of the podcast is about art and magic and their connections. And it is so interesting that after doing the MA, well, first your undergraduate degree in theology, your MA in studies of esoterics, and then your religious studies again, but your PhD, you brought that to bear not on Dion Fortune's like magical essays, but rather on her magical fiction as a vector of initiation. Now, tell me about that. How does that work?
Okay. So my original plan for the PhD work was that I wanted to look at the transmission of tantric ideas and Hindu ideas into the contemporary New Age through Fortune's work. And I had this great idea. And ultimately, I realized that it wasn't within my own wheelhouse to do, but also that there was more fundamental work to be done about her fiction first. And my supervisor we had some long discussions about where it would begin, because there is still very, very little work done in a sort of literary context on Fortune. I mean, there's not much done in any context academically, but almost nothing.
For the good of anyone, including myself, who doesn't know too much about her, can you just give us like the very swift bullet point? Who, when, where, what is Dion Fortune?
Okay, so Dion Fortune, who I sort of fell in love with in my MA, she was an English occultist, mystic. She was born in, I'm so bad with dates, like 1904, and she died in 1945, just before the end of World War II. She was operating in the same kind of time as Crowley. She met him a few times. They had very different opinions about magic, but they were in communication at the end of their life. They wrote letters back and forth. She wrote a whole bunch of books. She was a journalist. She wrote The Mystical Kabbalah and Psychic Self-Defense, both of which are still pretty popular. Yeah. She started a cult. She was a member of the Stella Matutina, which is like a Golden Dawn subgroup. No.
Oh no, Golden Dawn was for both, wasn't it? Yeah. Sorry, go on.
And then she also founded the Society of the Inner Light, which is still around today. That was the end of it. And then she wrote some fiction.
So, okay, so she did a massive amount of stuff that she achieved in actually a very short life. Like she died in her 40s then?
Yeah, she wasn't very, she was born right around 1900 and died in 45. So she was only in her mid-40s and she died really suddenly as well. Possibly of leukemia.
And so, I think that like what I would first think of when you say her name, I think of psychic self-defense and the mystical Kabbalah. which I haven't read. I just know them by reputation, you know, and they're kind of on my list of like, yeah, one of these days. And then the Society of the Inner Light, like I would have kind of vaguely known about that, but again, kind of think, oh wow, that's still going. Oh, adorable. But I didn't know of her really as a fiction writer at all. So tell me, what were her novels?
So she wrote 4 books of what she deemed occult fiction. She called them her occult novels. She had written one previous to the series of 4 called The Demon Lover, which is still about occultism. It's about this black brother and him like dying and coming back to life, but it's a romance, so it's a little more straight, as it were.
Right.
The occult novels are each meditations on a Kabbalistic sphere, right? They are based on one Kabbalistic Sephiroth, and they sort of are supposed to epitomize and tell a story about it. She wrote a little article that appeared in her magazine to coincide with the publication of the first one that talked about them being initiatory. And she explained how she thought that worked.
Yeah.
And she had a plan to write 10. She wanted to write one for every sphere.
Of course, it would make sense, right?
But she didn't finish Moon Magic, which is the 4th. And that was finished by someone else after her death. But they are Moon Magic. I'm doing the reverse order: Sea Priestess, the Goatfoot God, and Winged Bull, or the Winged Bull.
Excellent. And so in fact, she's writing these fictions that are explicitly set out to be initiatory, and which are following a specific path up the Sephiroth. So she's doing this on purpose. Now, do you think she thought that there is a better chance of getting more to sort of activate their initiation or whatever through fiction than, you know, no matter how many people you get to sign up for your mail order courses for the Society of the Inner Light, like more people potentially will buy a book off a rack at a train station?
So there's 2 levels of it, right? There's the straight up wider audience, and she talked about that. Like, no matter, you know, there's going to be a much wider audience for an occult novel always than there is just for a straightforward, like, the mystical Kabbalah.
Yeah.
But it's not only that, right? There is an element of that, but there's also an element to which, while like the mystical Kabbalah itself is interesting because although it's non-fiction, it's very visionary and it's very poetic, and it can have quite an initiatory effect if you are someone who is well versed in these things already, right? But for somebody going in a little colder, or even perhaps with more knowledge, her idea was that the fiction, it didn't just like tell you about the things, it actually took you through the emotional journey. So you yourself would relate to the character, feel like you were going through the initiatory processes, and some of them even contain really quite precise information on making a contact and like how you would go about finding a sort of hidden master to initiate you. She was actively like putting that in this novel, and I think she really hoped that people would you know run with that, and I think people did. So it's
fascinating. That's really amazing, and I the sort of things I want to say crowding forward, trying to get first, but for one thing, it sort of makes me think very strongly of that sort of 90s comic books thing, like Alan Moore and Grant Morrison with Promethea and the Invisibles, and like very clearly they were basically just doing that, like, and in the medium that was sort of appealing and easy to find at the time. Comic books, also because they're so visual, perfect, you know, and doing these kind of very, very explicitly initiatory things. Now, she's doing that back then. You say you think it worked. Do we have evidence? Are there accounts of people, like of readers, of reviewers, of experiencers of her occult fiction from the time?
Not really, no. There is, I mean, not that, okay, I should qualify that, not that I've been able to find. Actually, her books didn't sell that well, despite the idea that they might do better. And I have come across reviews, and they're usually they're like often okay, but I have never come across anything that's like, this changed my life. She herself recounts a story about someone bringing her a copy of her first of The Winged Bull, and of it being in her library actually, and that someone had been so horrified that they'd thrown it in the trash after finishing it. But then they had taken it back out because they were scared that it would corrupt the bin men, and so they had brought it to her to dispose of.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah.
So that was a great story. But when I talk about I think it's what, I'm not meaning, and I don't think she would have meant either, you know, these people clearly state that this book had a lasting effect on them, right? You could absolutely find people who even today, and I know plenty of people personally, or even people like Alan Richardson who publish about all of the impact that Fortune's works had on them. But I'm also thinking about the huge growth in like Avalon-centric spirituality that can be directly traced to Fortune. Things like what's it called? There's a very famous novel that's my key example of someone using Fortune, the name of which, The Mist of Avalon. That's what I'm trying to think of. Which has a, the author is very problematic, but the point is that deeply draws from Fortune's work and then sort of does something new with it based on what she was doing, and that in turn has had a huge influence on things. So I think you can trace this sort of cultural influence. So the most potent influence that she's had, the way that you can really see, I think, this initiatory power play out from her novels, is in a lot of the stuff that's gone into sort of Avalonian forms of spirituality. So like Grail stuff, Glastonbury stuff, this, you might even call it an egregore, has been really potent on the New Age, particularly in Britain, but I think in America and sort of Anglophile world more generally, both in its, particular symbols and particular readings of the Arthurian myth, like a kind of feminist revision of it. But, and this is the flip side of that, it's also got this very, very binary approach to gender, and uses this sort of a thing that Fortune calls the Arthurian initiation formula, which is that a man will initiate a woman, will initiate a man, will initiate a woman.
Oh,
this sort of structure. And she draws it directly from like the fairy experience, right? So like Arthurian myth and Morgan and then Arthur and Melusine, and there's a lot of, it's really interesting, and I think she's onto something, but it's also then been reified through her work to become like really, really strong. And you see that sort of implied in a lot of contemporary esoteric approaches. And like, I think a lot of the stuff about sexism in the contemporary like occult worlds has at its root this deeper like understanding of gendered initiation that Fortune really had a big influence on.
How interesting. I mean, that's absolutely fascinating. And I think that certainly I can absolutely see that current being expressed in sort of 1950s and 60s Wicca, for example, like the original Wiccans. It was very gender binary and very much about that man initiates woman, woman initiates man thing, which is fascinating. And of course, Avalonian, Arthurian sort of mysticism and magic and occultism throughout the rest of the 20th century, was huge. It's so interesting to hear that she was such a kind of a primary influence in those things. I mean, of course, she would have been quite contemporary, let's say, when she's in her early 20s, you've got The Wasteland coming out with the footnotes about Jessie Weston and the Grail legends. What is it, From Ritual to Romance? So it clearly she was also part of a whole generation that were not with this stuff or coming out with this stuff. It made me think too, though, what you said about the reaction to her work. That one about the person who didn't want to corrupt the bin men is amazing. But it made me think that actually the beginning of her publications, her literary publications, would have been very much contemporary also with the first of the Dennis Wheatley novels in the 1930s.
Yeah.
Because he was one of those things again that I always thought, oh gosh, I must read them sometime. And last summer, I think I got a few of them, and my God, they are unbelievable. But talk about like gender binary and sexism. But I can kind of see how his would be the best sellers, and hers wouldn't, because his are like, The Devil Rides Out and To the Devil a Daughter, famously made into films in the 70s. But like, they're very much black magic and sex and James Bond and international travel, exotic stereotypes, very racist about anyone who isn't, British and Anglo-Saxon. Most of the women are fainting, shrinking violets or evil temptresses. Like, you can kind of see why they were popular. They're also kind of awful, but.
And I mean, I think although Fortune wanted her novels to be popular, they weren't written for popularity. They were written to genuinely initiate. I don't think Dennis Wheatley was trying to, genuinely communicate full truths. Fortune did actually also write potboilers, right? Also in the 1930s. And they weren't occult, although they have bits of that come in. But notably, they're really, really racist. And even worse on the gender binary stuff. And I only mention this because it seems so clear that she was tapping into what was popular. And that was the thing that was selling right then. They have been recently republished for the first time. So I got to read 3 new Fortune novels. That's 4. And they're all very, very Fortune, but very unesoteric. But
and what did you say they were? What kind of novels? I kind of missed the.
They're all like romances of various kind, but one is a police thriller that's also a romance. One is set in colonial Africa and is a strange like river journey romance. One is set in colonial China and is another strange sort of oriental romance. And the last one, which is actually the best one by far, is called The Scarred Wrists and is about an ex-con and is a really interesting exploration of PTSD in like 1935, which was so fascinating to read.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And it's, it is amazing to us, I guess, to see how, like, I feel like especially genre fiction tends to just blare the kind of the prejudices of its time. Like, even like that's not what it's about, but they're kind of the easy sort of go-to scenes or stereotypes or tropes that people reach for, Funnily enough, if you see my lovely bookshelves back there, which I've inherited from the previous owners of this house, and they even left me a lot of the old Colonel's books in his study here. And his books are hilarious. Like, history of religion, military history. He served in North Africa as a cavalry officer, like actually with horses, like in the 30s. But there's a bunch of the books are romance novels, like really the paper is so cheap. It's so kind of hard now and dusty and everything. And they're all these romance novels, and they're just like what you're describing. They're like, okay, now let's do one in Indochina. Now let's do one, and just exotic location. And, if you want to have a threat or if you want to have a crisis, or so often the things that cause them are profoundly racist or whatever, in that early 20th century era.
I think, although I agree with all this, I do think when it comes to Fortune, we have to be quite careful because she did have very, very racist views and was actively engaged with what was in that period the eugenics movement, as allied particularly to women's reproductive health and breakthroughs around contraception. That in the period when we're talking about the 20s and 30s, the Mary Stopes Clinic was eugenically conceived, right? These things were all entwined, and there was also these deep connections with the Theosophical Society. So this was very much, the same women in particular were going to these things. And with Fortune, who is, racist not only to non-Anglo-Saxon people, but just to literally everybody that she can say something unpleasant about sometimes. That has had a lasting effect as well. And on the Avalon thing, because the other aspect of the sort of Glastonbury style, what I'm calling Avalon, I mean like the Glastonbury Grail myth, right?
Yes.
Is that it has this sort of weird connections with race and with ideas about British ancestry and the ideas about tradition that were invented. I mean, this is not a real tradition, so there cannot be real ancient Avalonian priestesses or real Atlantean connections, right? But Fortune was a major player in making that out to be important and making those sort of imaginal claims about race to be so important. And one of the things that she does in her novels a lot is emphasize ancestral connections and racial connections. And I think we see the way that that's played out even now, like very strongly. And that's something I try and bring out in my work about her is, it's not that we should just say, okay, there's these racist implications. We need to look at what that's doing even now, because that's the other side of her influence,
I mean, absolutely. And I think that, our the whole occult scene, the whole pagan scene, all of it has these really problematic underlying things about tradition, rootedness, what that means. And of course they do, because those ideas, which in some ways are fundamental to the human experience, so easily can be distorted into a way of hating each other, and we see it all the time. You're absolutely right. I think everything that you just said there, everybody who hears this will be just going, oh yeah, like, and just, they'll know, they'll have examples just lining up in their mind's eye, because it's all over the place. And it's one of the sort of the big paradoxes, I think, about magic and the occult is that it tends to attract both extremes, the really, really goodies and the really, really baddies.
See, and I would actually say it was even more complex than that. I've been thinking about this a lot. Well, I mean, it's been a big part of my
life. Baddies, I mean, that wasn't the complex version.
Well,
yeah.
No,
yeah,
I
you're
know.
right. Go on.
Well, I was more thinking that so there's two levels of thing. Magic attracts very intelligent people, and many very intelligent people are not very nice people, right? There is the idea that, morality is entwined with magic, right? It is perfectly words. There is this lasting sort of Christian, I think, idea that if you are involved in magic and esotericism and occultism, that you will withhold certain Christian moral standards, and that especially sort of social standards that, I mean, yes, I agree, we should treat other people nicely, but I also see that there is magical potential in the evil of not doing that. And I think it's very complex to sort of, this is not me justifying bad behavior. This is me trying to proceed that one of the big problems we have is that in society generally, and especially in the cult, we like to go, well, they're bad. That's the bad thing there. That's the bad thing there. And try and really ring fence and protect ourselves from these bad things that we are not. But that when we're looking at endemic racism and endemic sexism, it's not about that person who's a racist, that group who's sexist, this person. It's about these really deep historical trends that are influencing us like every day. They're influencing us because of the books we've read, they influence the group dynamics that we're in, and that we can't like get rid of these huge systemic problems by isolating particular pockets of them, calling them monstrous, and then just saying that we're not involved with them anymore.
Oh,
it doesn't work. And it doesn't work psychologically either to act like we aren't also capable of bad things and that there isn't,
But you say it doesn't work. It doesn't work psychologically. I think that it's not that it doesn't work. It's that it's not a good thing. But it functions in the sense that choosing an out group, being part of an in group, like wanting to belong by blaming someone else. Like, I mean, this is fundamental to the way people function, and we're doing it all the time. And also that tendency that we have is being exploited all the time by people in power in order to set us against each other. But I mean, yes, you're absolutely right. I did want to bring up one thing though. I mean, yes, very intelligent people are sometimes quite nasty, but dumb people are often assholes as well. You know, let's not let them away with it. No, but I mean that what I think was interesting was the idea that people can be tempted by that side of magic and the esoteric that is transgressive and that is to do with power. Now, empowerment of oneself and self-actualization is one thing, but I think that you're absolutely right. There's always that temptation to see the power and kind of, I guess, I mean, it's so corny in a way, but it's like the sort of the easy way to it is by doing the bad thing or choosing the corrupt thing or by choosing power over others. Like
it's corny because it's a deep truth, right? I mean, it is corny.
Yes, exactly. But I'm thinking that, like, you know, if I don't be careful about how I choose my words, I'll sound like I'm Darth Vader. You know what I mean? But it's true that, you know, sometimes the corrupt choice and the choice of power over is absolutely tempting.
And I think that's like the fear of admitting that is one of the big problems, right? The fear of admitting when you are really involved in these self-empowerment practices, and you can totally, if you want to, take them to this place of power over you, and you have to, on the basis of your own understanding, decide that that's not good, means that there are going to be plenty of people who are actually like, oh no, that sounds cool.
Yeah.
We can't escape that these technologies can be used like that, and they're not, it's not different, right? It is not a, like, although they're different streams and they're going to look different, it's not a sectioned off thing when someone's using that badly, so now this is here. It's all still connected.
It's not, and it's also all still on a continuum, and like sometimes you know, where is the line between just using your own capacities and capabilities and abusing them in a way that is harmful to others? Like, you know, because again, and I'm not trying to ever justify it, but I'm just saying we're probably all a lot closer to it than we would like to think at times, purely by exploiting our own capacities or whatever in ways that we have learned to do. To be honest, I often say that we deserve a lot more credit for not becoming supervillains, like for not choosing evil. I want more people to thank me. I would make an excellent baddie.
Right. But I mean, this is all jokes, but also, I mean, I'm deeply committed to moral relativism, right? I mean, I do agree with the general code of like social ethics, but I also think that when it comes to things like power, why is the cartoon baddie a baddie, right? It's usually because their opinion about what's good for society is different to everyone else's, right? And I think the initiatrix, and this goes back to the femme fatale and the initiatrix, right? Why is she evil? Because she will have power over you. Well, when the femme fatale is initiatrix, she has power over you to lead you to this place. In Fortune's work, she's evil coded in order to seduce you and lead you through an initiation experience, right? In my own capacity as, you know, a ritualist, if I am leading a group in a ritual, I am in a position of power over them. It's not about not having the power, it's about wielding it responsibly and to a certain end that will benefit everybody rather than just myself. But I don't think it's even as simple as being like, well, I mustn't try and have power over people. I think that it is a constant shifting, and that's why it's so difficult.
Yeah, and I think that that's what I was trying to say. You say it very well. What I was trying to say is that we also can't avoid it. Like, just by the nature of the world, we end up sometimes being in a position of power and sometimes not. And it's all about, like you say, it's about how we choose to pursue or not pursue, how we choose to use it, how we choose to balance it. But again, and I think this is it's a really important point that you bring up, it doesn't help us to point the fingers at someone else and say, no, it's them. They're the bad ones. They're doing bad things. Rather, we need to always be examining our own selves and our own, and to accept that whatever those, whatever the bad things are, we're not as far away from them as we'd like to think, and we need to be constantly examining those dynamics and those exchanges and those sort of, like mutual responsibilities, mutual care. Really important.
Yeah, I think, magic is about playing with power and playing with religion and playing with morality. And I wish more magical practitioners recognize that by doing these power practices, you are going to have to grapple with a slightly more sophisticated approach to morality than maybe you were used to. Yeah.
I guess your training in philosophy and theology and so on, it gives you a lot of depth in your ability to think with these concepts that maybe some people just don't have those, right? Some of us have not gone very far with philosophy, for example, and it shows. But I do think also that in acting responsibly, both with magic, religion, and with art, in fact, and all of them together as one, by acting responsibly with them and generously with them and caringly with them, one also manages to sort of, be open about that work and sort of model good ways of self-examination and good ways of relationality with other people, I guess. I hope.
I mean, like yes, because we're being recorded, but really, and I'm going to say it anyway, to me, responsibility, like even that is something that is complicated and in flux. Like, to be responsible with your art, I think absolutely not. I think I'm actually committed to being irresponsible with it, especially in the way that I share it in the world. And the same with the magic. Like, yes, there's a degree to which I'm aware that I could harm and have harmed and will try not to do that again. But I also recognize that following it often means doing something that's really stupid and potentially harmful, whether to myself or the thing that I have planned, or perhaps someone else. But that's sometimes part of the thing, part of the initiation, part of the magic. And, again, the being too obsessed with some quite Christianized moral good, moral responsibility is one of the reasons that we still have so much weird discourse around black magic and weird discourse around cursing and sacrifices and voodoo, and these are still othered so much because there's this commitment that if you're an occultist or an esoteric practitioner, you should be good, right? But what we mean by good is we actually often mean rationalistic Christian good.
Yeah. I mean, that's true, and I'm definitely gonna take that clip and share it widely and say, see, Georgia van Raalte, she is approving of black magic and human sacrifice. No, but I guess you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right to pull me up on that. And I think that as you were saying your objection, what I wanted to respond with was, yes, but responsibility, not just responsibility to other people, certainly not responsibility to society, but also responsibility to the art and to the magic, right? I guess I mean responsibility rather than an idea of ethics or what is being good, but being responsible, like, I'm doing this is me, I'm responsible, I'm going to negotiate my relationships with these things. Conscious.
I still really reject that word. I do get what you're saying, and I totally see how that works. But I'm like, surely it would be like commitment. To me, to be responsive, responsible is still quite a. I guess you're right. Yeah, it's taking into account what you do. I do see what you're saying, that this is my magic, my choice. I'm doing this. But that's often the thing that I'm avoiding precisely, is to say that this is not just me, that I'm doing it, that this is something I truly see as being beyond me, and therefore I'm not responsible. Not that I'm trying to evade responsible. I'm talking on a more of like a metaphysical level there, I think.
Yeah. Like as in at that point when you are like, you were acting in concert with and in line with and in sort of tune with the movements of other things like spirits or magic, or that you're. I understand. I mean, perhaps I plead too much. I'm neither in practice or in general life am I the most responsible person ever. I do have some tendencies towards recklessness, so maybe I'm trying to convince myself,
And I'm actually very responsible and unreckless, so maybe I'm just trying
to well, I guess that by our subtext shall ye know us. So I'm just looking at the time, and I think we're gonna begin to move towards our end. What's your next project? What's going on next?
So what am I doing next? I am imminently hoping to publish my next book, which is going to be about and a initiation. It's going to be me sharing some of the sort of visionary work and rituals that I've been doing over the past year or so. And I'm quite excited about that because yeah, I've been working with this sort of material and these ideas for some time. I've done a lot of like online path workings with them, but I'm really excited to sort of get the words out there. So that's cool. But it's still.
Do you have a title for it yet? Do you have a title?
It will be called Body Babalon.
Body Babalon.
Body Babalon.
Excellent. Now I'm going to, in the show notes, I am going to include a link to Georgia's really cool website, and a link to the page which has all of your current books. And there's also, you've got a really cool blog project that you did last year, with lovely images and sort of very interesting flowing writing stuff, very surreal. I remember every time I read one of them, I would kind of, if it came up on a notification or something on my phone, I say, wait, don't read that right now. Wait till you're in a safe place. You might faint. Kind of an out of body experience type thing. And then so a new book coming out, and last year as well, you ran an excellent online course on the history of sex magic, right?
Yes, it was actually in two parts. So the first half was the history of sex magic, and the second half was sexual magic in theory and practice. And they were really wonderful. It was such a unique experience teaching like that. And I made some amazing new connections. And I will be rerunning those probably from October. So I will open and be advertising booking for those in the next month or two. So
excellent. I will also have a, maybe a placeholder or a link or something. And whenever Georgia announces the opening of registration for that course, those courses, I will come back and put in a link in the show notes to it, to where you can get your places. I would have loved to take part this time, but I was in the middle of moving house, so we didn't have time. But reading the course description and reading you had all the lecture titles and everything, it just looks absolutely brilliant. So I'm hopefully this year I will take that course as well. It's really interesting to talk to you and to see how this project, which is your life, and all these aspects of it, just are spun together in this web of weird and interesting. I love it. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
And I look forward to speaking to you again soon, either here or elsewhere. And yeah, and I recommend highly that anyone whose interest is piqued by this dark magician, blood sacrifice promoting person I've just been talking to, who's also an excellent academic, then that they should check out the links in the show notes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.